Okay, so this is Unit 5, Video 2 for U.S. History, and in this video we're going to look at Civil War generals and important people, as well as the major battles and some turning points. We're going to start with the Confederate generals. And Robert E. Lee is probably the most famous Civil War general of all time, North or South. Especially, in the South, that name is very familiar to us. Lincoln actually offered him command of all the Union forces before Virginia ever seceded. But when Virginia seceded, Lee led the Confederate Army. Lee's leadership gave the South a real advantage despite being heavily outnumbered in pretty much every battle. And in the last video, we looked at all the advantages that the North had. But these generals, this leadership that the South has, is really what keeps them afloat for most of this war. We're also going to look at Thomas Stonewall Jackson, another important leader for the Confederates. His ability to lead his oftentimes outnumbered troops against larger and better equipped opponents also helped the South defeat the North in a lot of these battles, especially early in the war. This war is not going well for the North for the first couple of years, and it's really due to the leadership of these guys, despite, as we said, being outnumbered. So this is Robert E. Lee on the left. This is a portrait painting of Stonewall Jackson, Thomas Jackson, and he lost his arm in the war. He was shot by his own men. He had ridden into camp late one night, and the guys on duty were, scared, nervous. I'm sure they were young privates, and so they fired at him and hit him in the arm. And so here's a buried monument to where Stonewall Jackson's arm was buried. But that, Jackson's not going to recover from that, and losing Jackson really is going to be a major setback for the South. Let's look at this guy also, Jefferson Davis. Davis was not a military commander. His role in the war was to serve as president of the Confederate States of America, this newly formed nation, as they saw it, in the South. And he worked to secure an alliance with a couple different European countries. He was never successful. He wanted Europe to recognize Southern independence. He really hoped that that would happen through cotton. By cutting off cotton supplies, he thought that that would get Europe to intervene and help them, but that never occurred. After this war is over, he's going to be captured, and he goes to prison for 2 years in Virginia as a result of this war. So we'll see a lot of people and a lot of battles in this video. So really, it's going to be you being able to look at who it is and know what role they played here. For Robert E. Lee, he is the leading commander. He's in charge of all Confederate forces. So what role does he play? He is the general for the South, for the Confederate States. Robert E. Lee is the head general for the whole South. Stonewall Jackson is going to be another major general for the Confederate States of America, and Jackson will really be Lee's right-hand man. When when Jackson does lose his arm, Robert E. Lee says, Jackson has lost his left arm, but I have lost my right. So he's referring to Stonewall Jackson here as being, that close to Lee and playing that pivotal of a role throughout the war. So both Lee and Jackson are generals in the South, with Lee being the major one in charge. And then what role does Davis play in the Civil War? So remember, he's going to be the president of the Confederacy when this thing gets kicked off. So we'll look at some Union generals now. The ones we just looked at, remember, Southern Confederates, okay? In March of 1864, Ulysses S. Grant was promoted to full command of the Union forces. Grant was instrumental in seizing the Confederate stronghold at Vicksburg, and we'll look at that battle actually in just a little bit. And that gave the Union control of the entire Mississippi River for the most part. And then in April of 1865, Robert E. Lee, who we just talked about, would surrender to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. And there's a picture of it here, or a painting rather, of Lee surrendering to Grant. And then this is an actual picture of Grant as a soldier. He would go on to serve as president after the war. Another Union general, a name you may be familiar with, especially in Georgia, William Tecumseh Sherman. He was another important general for the Union Army. He's most famous for his capture of the city of Atlanta and leading a march to the sea to capture Savannah. So you've probably heard Sherman's March to the Sea, then that's what this is referring to. His approach was to wear down the enemy, to wear down the Confederacy, to destroy their will to fight. And he used what we call scorched earth tactics, which are his tactics. Those are still debated today in terms of their morality, and the ethics of those. But he said whenever two countries are at war with each other, all the peoples of one are at war with all the peoples of the other. And so that was his mindset as he marched through the South. And this is a picture of Sherman here on the right. So couple of questions here. What role does Grant play in the Civil War? Just like Lee is the kind of head general for the South, Grant is going to be that for the North. He's not going to be there the entire time. Grant doesn't take this role until 1864. The war only has 1 year left at that point. So Grant is not the main guy in charge for the first 3 years of this war, and it's part of the reason that the North wasn't able to win some of these victories. They probably didn't have the right people in charge, but once Grant takes over, he's able to use the North's superior numbers. And then the other question asks you, what role does Sherman play in the war? And so he's another Union general for the North. He and Grant will be close. Grant will call on him to do several things, and one of those things that Sherman does is march through Atlanta, as we talked about. So let's get into the battles. We're going to talk about 5 specifically here. The first one is Fort Sumter, and this was an American fort in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. Some of you may have been there. In April of 1861, the Confederates gave the Union troops that were inside Fort Sumter a notice to abandon the fort. The Confederates said, "Look, we've seceded. This is in South Carolina. You need to get out of the fort." Well, the Union's not going to surrender this fort, and as a result, the Confederates started bombing or shelling with cannon fire the fort until finally Union troops surrendered, and the Civil War begins. This is the first battle of the Civil War, and it's in April of 1861. After the Confederate victory, many states in the upper South decided to secede and join the Confederacy. So that would be Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, as well as Arkansas. So this is after the Confederate victory at Fort Sumter. Many of these states decide to join the Confederacy, bringing the number up to 11. So the Confederacy will have 11 states. Here's a artist rendering of Fort Sumter being shelled. And this is it today. You can visit. You can take a ferry out from Charleston. It's a neat visit if you're ever there. The second war we're going to look at is Antietam, and this is in Maryland. September of 1862, we get Union and Confederate troops fighting here at Antietam Creek in Maryland. And this was the first major battle that we see on northern soil. So Maryland did not secede. Even though they're a slave state, they stayed in the Union. So this is technically northern soil. Antietam proved to be the deadliest one-day battle of the Civil War. I think casualties were around 26,000 people in one day. And neither side really secured a victory. Lee escaped to the south without Union troops pursuing him. Lincoln was furious that the North didn't go after Lee and try to capture him. The South's failure to win the battle, however, encouraged Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. So it wasn't that the North just had this overwhelming victory. It was just that they didn't lose. And at that early of a stage in the war, that hadn't been happening much for the North. They had really been getting beat pretty regularly. So this was an opportunity for Lincoln to issue the proclamation, which we talked about in the last video. And that's a key, understanding that the Emancipation Proclamation was released as a result of the Battle of Antietam. So why was Fort Sumter an important event? Obviously, it's the first battle of the Civil War, which is important enough. So just understand Fort Sumter as the first battle of the Civil War. And then also, why was Antietam an important event? A couple things here. It's the deadliest one-day battle of the war. And I'm emphasizing one day because we're going to talk about Gettysburg again in a minute. So for one day of fighting. Antietam was the bloodiest one-day battle, but also it encouraged Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation as a result. So those are the two keys there for Antietam. Let's talk about Vicksburg now. From May to July of 1863, Ulysses S. Grant laid siege, which is basically to blockade the city of Vicksburg, Mississippi. Now, this is before he takes command of all Union forces. Vicksburg sat up on a high bluff overlooking the Mississippi River, so whoever controlled that city really controlled the river because you couldn't get past that with the guns that were atop of these bluffs. So during the 7 weeks, the Union basically starved out the citizens, and finally the city surrendered. And it gave the Union complete control of the Mississippi and cut the Confederacy in half geographically, because now the Union could navigate all the way up the Mississippi pretty much freely. Vicksburg and Gettysburg, and we're going to talk about Gettysburg next, but they ended almost at the exact same time, just hours apart, really. And they gave the Union a much needed boost of morale and really served as the beginning of the end for the South. We're going to look at this picture of Vicksburg, and you can see the flow of the Mississippi comes around here. So anyone that had this town really could control what happened on that river by just firing down cannons and that sort of thing. So the Union just basically surround the city and lay siege to it and starve the citizens out until finally they agree to surrender. Sorry. Okay, Gettysburg here. So in July of 1863, Union and Southern troops clashed in the quiet town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. This is a 3-day battle, and in those 3 days, 51,000 soldiers were killed or wounded, making it the bloodiest battle of the war. Your PowerPoint says died, but it's died or wounded here between both sides. So Northern and Southern troops combined 51,000 casualties. So Gettysburg is the bloodiest battle of the war. Antietam was the bloodiest one-day battle with 26,000. So I know that's confusing. Try and make note of that on your paper. So the South loses at Gettysburg, and this was a major turning point in the East. So Vicksburg is out west on the Mississippi, so that was the turning point in the West, and basically at the exact same time, Gettysburg is a loss for the Confederates, which is a turning point there. So the North has two major victories in this short time span, and as a result of Gettysburg, Lee will never again invade the North. This was to be the last time that he goes onto Northern soil. Geography played a key role here as well at Gettysburg. Gettysburg is surrounded by steep hills and rugged terrain. You may have heard them called the Little Round Top or the Big Round Top. So Union troops were able to secure and fortify those hills, keeping the Confederates from the top. And the Confederates tried multiple times to take those hills, and they couldn't. So that would be a key for the geography there. The final battle we have to discuss here is Atlanta. From July to September of 1864, Sherman is going to lay siege to the city of Atlanta before finally capturing it after 6 weeks. So similar to how Grant laid siege to Vicksburg, Sherman is going to do that to Atlanta. And the city was in a key location and really had become the major transportation hub for the South. It was a railroad hub, so all of these lines converged in Atlanta. And so what railroads the South did have, Atlanta was really the key. And Sherman wanted to destroy the South's ability to resupply its troops by disrupting that railroad system, and that was what he did. And so he burned Atlanta, he marched to the sea, and they destroyed crops, livestock, anything that his troops couldn't consume themselves, they would destroy, which made it very tough on civilians. They also destroyed railroads. They would take the railroad steel beams out of the ground, heat up the middle over fire, and then bend those steel rails around trees so that they couldn't be reused. They were called Sherman neckties in the South. And this made the North realize that it was going to win this war, and it gave Lincoln an easy re-election in the fall of that year. Atlanta's falling was really the key. This is a picture from Gettysburg today, and you can they have a statue up here. But this is one of the round tops, so you can get an idea. If you could control this, then you could fire down on troops, and so that was what the North was able to do in that battle. And this is a sign that is in Atlanta, and you can read that about the destruction of Atlanta. Hopefully, maybe you can make out those words if you want to pause it and take a look at it. So your questions here, why was the Battle of Vicksburg an important event? Well, it was a turning point in the Western theater of this war, and it gave the Union control of the Mississippi River, and that was really an important part. And how did geography impact this battle? So if whoever could control the high ground really could control that river. And so, because of that, Grant knew that he couldn't attack on the river. He knew it had to be a land siege, and so he did that. He did lay siege to the city by land. Okay, so the next question asks, why was the Battle of Gettysburg an important event? So, just like Vicksburg in the West, Gettysburg was the turning point in the Eastern Theater. And so, with that many casualties, obviously that's an important event as well. But really, Gettysburg is key because it is a turning point in the East, and Lee will never again invade northern soil after this. Your final question asks, why were the Battle of Atlanta and Sherman's March to the Sea important events? So, this is really the nail in the coffin for the South. They'll fight. They'll continue to fight for the next 6 or 7 months, but really after Atlanta falls and Sherman kind of destroys so much infrastructure throughout Georgia, it really cripples the South's ability to fight this war. And so those are your key events.